destructive. Our military needs a pop, but it can't be a blank check. And that's what this president recognizes. He deserves a great deal of credit for that, and Russ Vought and his team did a great job.
That's Jim's question. Now, here's mine. Yeah. One of my former broadcasters, he sadly passed away about 3 years ago, was Dr. Peter Vincent Pry.
Yeah, sure.
He was the chief of staff of the Congressional EMP Commission, and we produced his radio show once a week and his regular TV show. We would love to have him here now because he had so much wisdom. Sure. But as you know, EMP was his thing, and I learned so much about EMP. How concerned are you about EMP when it comes to North Korea, China, and these other countries? And what about hardening our grid? I mean, all the money we've sent to Ukraine, could we have not hardened our grid from EMP for that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we need to make sure that we've got in our national security matrix a whole lot of things that we're not talking about, things you're not mentioning here, like farms that can produce food that we need, medicine supplies, things that we learned during COVID that were important, but also a grid that is stable and secure and reliable. That starts, by the way, with energy production that is actually reliable, like nuclear power and clean burning natural gas, not wind and solar and things that are much more easily disrupted. Batteries that we're setting up in all these places that use up a lot of water. We need to do our part to have a really strong grid based on reliable power, harden the grid, do what we need to do, and then have a strong defense capable of defending any attacks. That is the number one responsibility in federal government, and that is what our core responsibility is under the Constitution, and that's what we ought to be doing.
Let's go real quick while time allows. Iran.
Yeah.
I have a reporter in Israel on the ground. I support the Jewish people. I don't always agree with the state of Israel, what the government does, but I support the Jewish people and their right to the land.
Sure.
But that doesn't mean I want boots on the ground.
Right.
I got a son who's draft age. I think we have to be really careful because I think Peter Pry told me for years that Iran already has the bomb, maybe several. Some people are saying we got to go strike them because they might get the bomb. Well, I think they already have the bomb. How concerned are you that if we were to strike Iran, that we're really stirring something up? And then we have to be worried about Hezbollah here, the terror cells here, the power grid, cyber, EMP. I mean, we have some folks want to go strike now. Yeah. Where are you come down on this? And what could it open up Pandora's box where it creates a real problem for us right here on the homeland with terror cells that are here since the borders were so open for so many years under Obama and then under Biden?
First of all, I have a great deal of trust in the president and his philosophy, which I think mirrors mine a great deal. Peace through strength. Something like I was a child of the 80s. I very much agree with President Reagan's peace through strength. We should not be engaged in constant conflict. Very clearly, President Trump agrees with that, right? So I have a great deal of trust that he has no desire to get us in any foreign entanglements. I also know that he's a good friend of Israel, as am I. I believe we need to stand alongside Israel because it is critical for our own national security. It does be very clear. And it's also important from the cultural and historic standpoint. Those things are not small. You know, going over there and walking where Jesus walked, going and walking where, you know, the literal founding principles of the Judeo-Christian principles that created the Western world, those are important. This war is spiritual. This war is, so I think that's critical. Now, as to Iran, look, again, I'm giving a lot of deference to the president. We need to, I think, hold Iran accountable. I think we need to be able to use the power of a strong economy, which is why we need to strengthen the economy under President Trump, the power of a strong military through peace through strength. I think we need to use diplomacy. But yes, we need to make clear to Iran that we have no intention of allowing them to get nuclear capability with strike capability. So you can say what you want about the bomb, but as soon as they have strike capability, this world changes immensely. We never should have let North Korea get that. Okay, that was a mistake. And so we need to, for our own national defense, do what we can to hold that back. So I'm going to pretty much leave it at that and allow the president to go do what he needs to do. But I support the president in pushing strongly on Iran to try to move forward. But what I don't want is a repeat of the Obama deals that allowed Iran to continue to do what they were doing in developing nuclear and get away with complete violation of whatever it was, the JCPOA or whatever the agreement was.
So what you're saying is having bombs one thing, having the missiles or the launch ability to strike is different, and you're saying that they're probably not there with the ability yet.
Well, I don't want to get into what they're capable or not capable of. What I want to get into is Iran is a foe. They are an enemy. They're an enemy of Israel, but they're an enemy of us. They would strike us as much as they would like to strike Israel, and we need to be cognizant of that, and we need to make sure that we are pushing back on their ability to gain and advance in their military capability. That's just, I think, we need to be strong and resolved in that. Again, the Obama approach under the JCPOA, whatever the acronym was, under the agreement then, was a failure. It allowed Iran to strengthen, and that hurt Israel and hurt us. So we need, and I think the president agrees, that we need to be pushing back and checking Iran. Whatever deal and whatever arrangement they reach, it cannot be anything like the Obama deal.
And then finally, where are you coming down on the whole issue of our debt, the death of the dollar? Gold's going up, which means the dollar's probably going down, right? It's not really gold going up, dollar going down. Where are you at with the eventual death of the dollar? How are we going to recover this economy? The Federal Reserve, the federal income tax. President Trump said before he got elected, hey, until about 1913, we were funding a lot of this with tariffs. Where do you come down on all that? How do we save this dollar, or do we have to roll to some kind of other tokenization and assets and gold and land and some new form of currency in our country?
Well, it's certainly unbiblical for our nation to be racking up debt and deficits with false promises to the people that we can't deliver upon and that are weakening our future, weakening our dollar, weakening our national security. That's what we're doing. Republicans and Democrats, they are pretty much equally guilty of it, okay? And I think this group of Republicans, hopefully, are understanding the importance of the resolve of limiting spending so that we can balance the budget. We must, under reconciliation and under all the tools at our disposal. The president's budget was a good start, but now we have to do the job. We can't be afraid of the reforms necessary to actually balance the budget. When Medicaid goes from $400 billion in 2019 to $615 or $20 billion in 25, when it's slated to be over $1 trillion by 2030, and there is no tax on Medicaid to pay for it, right? Medicare and Social Security come out of taxes. Medicaid comes out of our budget. You want to know why our budget's exploding? It's because of the failure of Obamacare expansion that is driving up the cost of health care and that is bankrupting the country with a massive expanded population getting subpar care. We should change that. But Republicans have to be willing to do it. I've never met a Republican who, well, let me rephrase that. So many Republicans come to this town, and the first thing they start doing is worrying about re-election. They're running their campaign for next year. Oh, Chip, if we end up in the minority, it'll be terrible. Look, the fastest way for you to end up in the minority is to do the crap you're doing, which is not leading. Like, do your job. Let the American people decide. But, we do that all the time. And so this is an opportunity for us to try to get it right. $37 trillion in debt, $1 trillion a year in interest. That's at 3.5%, 3.8% interest costs. If that goes to the historical rate of 5%, that's another $2 or $3 trillion of interest. It's crazy. We're going to destroy our country because politicians want to give away free stuff. And I gave a floor speech one time. We're not the United States House of free stuff. We've got to actually be serious. And Ronald Reagan was doing an interview with Johnny Carson in the 1970s, and he said, every politician, if they put forward a program, should have to include a tax to pay for it. Guess how many programs would get adopted if you had to include a tax to pay for it? Very few. President Reagan wasn't a tax raiser. He didn't want the tax increase, but he knew that we will sell our souls to the devil for a vote. And that's what Congress does all the time. I'm a cancer survivor. I got people come in going, I need cancer research. I'm like, God bless you. I want cancer research, but are you going to pay for it? Well, we don't have a pay for it. I'm like, well, I can't support it. I can't support it. It's ALS, all these other things. Like, we have to do our job to save this country. That's actually our job in a Republican form of government. So I'm going to keep fighting to try to not just balance the budgets, let's have actual fiscal discipline and responsibility. Importantly, let's empower the American people to go forward and live their lives and prosper.
Last question for me,
according to biblical
Brandon.
Principles in defense of Western civilization. And those are the things that animate me every day.
Okay. Jim has one last question. What is that, Jim?
1.5 million in the first year, yes or no? In the 10-year, yes or no?
1.5 million in the first year, and what was the rest, Jim?
Trillion. 1.5 trillion in
1.5 trillion
in the first 2 years.
In the first year,
or 1.5 trillion in the 10 years.
First 2 years, he says. Or 1.5 trillion in the 10 year.
Over 10 years. So what's he asking about the reconciliation package? If I gather his question correctly,
he's right.
Are we? So right now, the minimum we put in the House budget was $1.5 trillion of reductions over 10 years. Target $2 trillion, and then you'd get economic growth attached to that. Then you would assume $4 trillion-ish in tax cuts. That's a lot of wonkery. That to get to the point of get enough spending cuts, then you can have more tax cuts, and everybody's happy. But a bunch of my guys don't want a bunch of Republicans are running away from the spending cuts. So guess what? You Americans are going to get fewer tax cuts. That's the model we've set up because we owe you no more additional deficits. By the way, if we get everything we want, the crazy fiscal hawks and conservatives, we will still be basically bleeding $1.8 to $2 trillion a year. We will still go from our current debt of $36 trillion to basically $56 trillion in 10 years. That's if I get everything I want. I'm just trying to save about, $3 or $4 trillion over the course of that decade. So we've got our work to do. We need to understand it starts with the cuts and the reductions in spending. $1.5 trillion is the absolute bare minimum, and our guys are barely even, scratching the surface of getting there.
Thank you, Congressman. And Jim Pfaff says thank you as well.
All right, tell Jim
thank you, sir. Thank you. All right, there you go, Jim. We dropped your name, and it worked, Jim. That's the first time, but, you know, there are miracles that do happen, Jim. I'm just joking, but that was great.
Yeah,
no, I know you do, Jim. That's why we're glad. That's why we're glad you're on our team. Jim, actually, folks, is extremely well connected in this town. He was chief of staff for Congressman Tom Massey, right? Right, Jim?
Thomas Massey and Tim Huelskamp. Don't ever call him Tom. It's Thomas.
Okay. Tom. Oh, yeah. Thomas. Okay, he doesn't like Tom. Thomas. Yeah. Thomas. And you and Congressman Roy, how did you work together when you were here?
Well, he was Ted Cruz's chief of staff when I was Tim Huelskamp's chief. And,
he was Ted Cruz's chief of staff. Okay.
The thing is, there are a lot of chiefs, or a decent amount of chiefs of staff, that go in and become members of Congress, and they are a waste. Chip Roy's not one of those people. He has done a fabulous job of pushing an agenda that has been necessary, attempting to hold these people on their feet to the fire. He exposes all the crud and the way that these stupid people think in Washington. And, you know, you just gotta, when you got a guy that is principled, a constitutionalist, and understands what's going wrong in that town, then and yet he's patient enough to do what Chip does and to stick with it. You know, we need more of him. We need 100 more of him, 100 more to Thomas, and we would be in really much better shape than we are right now.
What did you make of the questions I was asking him and his response to those questions?
No, listen, they were all good, and he answered them well. The one thing that I'm struggling with personally is this fact that we're going to do 1.5 trillion over the 10-year window, because those cuts never materialize. And but hey, listen, if we can get the tax cuts in for middle class folks, that's good, and it ought to be there. And I think it's going to help the economy in the long run, to be candid. We're a consumer economy. We're working to get back to an industrial economy or something closer to it than we have been before. So at the end of the day, you have to have people have money to consume. And we need to stop taking money out of people's pockets, funding this crap. So we've got a huge bit of work to do. I'm not very happy about where reconciliation is going in terms of changing, you know, bending the curve downward in the long term. But there are some things in it that'll be useful and I'll be happy about. So Chip's trying to deal with that, and it's a frustrating thing. It's really horrible.
Yeah. Well, again, he was one of the guys we wanted to interview. So, again, we asked our audience to pray for providential appointments and meetings. And I have to tell you, we've had several of them this trip. But I don't know if you know that, Jim. I asked our audience on 74 Christian stations to pray for providential and divine appointments to interview people, because I got to be honest with you, and you were a chief of staff, so maybe you know. But I have to tell you, there are some really good press people here on Capitol Hill for these congressmen, and then there are some that are horrible. There was a congressman, I won't name him because I don't want to embarrass his staffer, but there was a congressman that we saw, just like we did just with Chip Roy, and I walked up to him and said, "Hi, I'm Brannon Howse with Worldview Tube," and he said, I know who you are. I've watched a lot of your videos, or I've watched some of your videos. I know who you are. And he shook my hand. He smiled. So I thought, I was hoping he liked me. Apparently he did. And I said, well, we've been trying to get an interview with you. And he said, well, this is the first I'm hearing about it. Who have you been contacting? And Logan was standing next to me and said the name of his press person. And he had a look on his face like, really? And I said, well, yeah, we just had Senator Tuberville, we had Senator Ron Johnson, we've had Glenn Grothman, we've had Marjorie Taylor Greene. We wanted to add you to the list. And he was like, and they didn't get back to you? And he's like, how long have you been emailing them? And Logan, what'd you say, Logan? A couple weeks? A couple weeks? And no response. And he was like, really? And he had about 3 or 4 staff people with him, and they all started pulling out their Capitol Hill business cards, handing them to Logan, saying, okay, we're going to fix that. Here you go. The point I'm making is we've actually had to come here to Capitol Hill to get some of these interviews because some of the staffers won't take phone calls, won't return emails. Others will. They're like Johnny on the spot. Boom. Yes, we checked you out. We know who you are. What do you want to do when you want to have them on? What's your plan? Others, you can't get a response. And today we got a congressman who just found out one of his press people wasn't doing their job for 2 weeks, and the look on his face was not positive. And he said, we're going to rectify that right here. And business cards started swapping hands. So did you have that experience that it's hard sometimes for people like us in the conservative media to interview the good guys because their staffers don't seem to want to maybe work longer hours or follow up on emails or be aggressive, and their bosses, without them knowing it, are missing out on platforms like ours?
Oh yeah, no, that story you can multiply through many members' offices, and it's not always necessarily of a certain kind of twist or political twist. Like, you know, you have great comms people with moderate members of Congress and very conservative ones, even slightly liberal ones on the GOP side. That it's not necessarily where they come across. It's the fact that there are a lot of staffers on Capitol Hill that are there for the resume piece, and they're hoping to turn it into something else they're ambitious for. Of course, they're usually very young and don't even know what to be ambitious about. And anyone who's ambitious to try to make money in politics is not likely to do very well, and that makes it even worse. But yeah, the whole mantra that staff is policy, this is one example of where that shows up for sure. Now, anyone on my staff that would not be responsive that way, and I didn't put up with it. I've had people work for me, and they, you know, I tell them right away, I say, you're going to want to walk off this job a couple times, because I'm going to tell you, do what the heck I said and make it happen. I did not suffer fools at all on my staff. Of course, I had two rock stars, people who were doing all the right things in Tim Heal's camp and Thomas Massey, and I wanted them to be served well. I was their advocate. In both cases, personally, I was a peer to them, but I was there to serve them. I was there to make sure that they could get done what I hoped they would do. I was fortunate to only work for two rock stars. I had no desire to be a Capitol Hill staffer, but I was willing to work with these two guys, and it was all worth it. But to that end, I needed to make sure that they were served well. So we had great people, and if they ever had a problem, I fired them, which was fairly rare, but it did happen on a couple of occasions. So yeah, this is a typical story on Capitol Hill.
So this is another reason why we felt we needed to come here, because we're like, you know, if we're getting stonewalled by a staffer who won't get us to a conservative congressperson, and you just heard Chip Roy mention the Bible several times. You know, he knows we're on 74 Christian stations. We mentioned that to him. So I think he would have mentioned the Bible anyway, but he knew he had an audience that was going to really track with him. So he mentioned the Bible. That's not very biblical to do this, whatever. Well, obviously we want to give a guy like that a platform. And if we find good people and we cannot get to them to give them a platform, they get demoralized or discouraged, thinking, where's the conservative media? Where's the Christian media? Aren't the Christians and the Christian audience and the Christian media guys interested in what I'm saying? Well, they would think we're not, because we don't contact them when we actually have been. So if we're not careful, some of these good guys who do stand for a Christian worldview can be discouraged, thinking none of the Christian guys will interview me or reach out to me, when in fact we are. I'm not saying that about Chip Roy's people. That's not the case. But I'm just saying he's a perfect example of someone we want to give a platform to. And that's why, Logan, I'm like, maybe we just got to go to Capitol Hill. If some of these staffers aren't going to do their job, we'll just go there and we'll just grab these guys. And we did. We've grabbed several of them today over this week off the cuff because of the problem we're running into. So I think it's good we came here, and we're going to come back. Here's another question. Logan asked this question. Why do so many of these guys turn over staff? We have one congressman we won't name. He's probably been through two or three staffers in the last year. And every time we turn around and we have a contact, we have their text, we can text them and get right to them, right? And we get a response. But then the next thing we know, they're gone. Why is there a really high turnover in Congress for staffers for these U.S. House of Representative members?
Well, the numbers of turnover are put out regularly for every office. So this is something that can actually be looked up, and it is one important factor. High turnover doesn't always necessarily mean that, particularly in the early years of a person's tenure in Congress, doesn't necessarily in every instance mean that they're messed up in some way. But there are some members of Congress that are just horrible to work with. And one thing that happens often is the spouse gets involved in managing it. And that's a no way. I had two guys.
Logan, did I just lose? Did I just lose Jim?
Oh,
he froze. You froze.
Oh, there we go.
Pick
I'm
it back
back.
up. You froze for a minute. You had two guys at what? I'm sorry.
I worked for two guys whose spouses I knew and worked with and coordinated some things with, but knew how important it was to let them be the member of Congress and manage what's going on. And you need that. But sometimes the spouse can be a problem. That can cause turnover. I'm just going to name one of them that has very high turnover, and notoriously so, and that's Victoria Sparks from Indiana. She has a very high turnover on her staff. I don't know what that means. I don't know Victoria well. I like her in how she votes. But listen, a lot of these people, until recently, don't make much money at all. Now, it's a little bit better now for many of them, but because they just allowed for some staff raises and a massive increase in congressional budgets. But that can be part of it, too. It's very hard to come to Washington, D.C., and you typically have to find 4 or 5 people that you can get an apartment with because you're making $30,000 to $40,000 a year. And if you know D.C., that is not comfortable
I'm glad you brought
all.
that up. I'm glad you brought that up because Logan said, how much do you think these staffers are making? And initially I guessed 30, 35,000. And then I said, no, it can't be that low. How would you ever live in D.C.? But you're telling me it is that low?
It can be for some people. A comms director is probably making in the 50 to 75 range. But I have to tell you, I haven't looked closely at staff salaries recently because they just recently raised the maximum amount that a staffer can make. It used to be like $169,000 when I was on the Hill. It's now gone up to, I believe, $210,000, and the budgets have increased. So when I was there, your typical budget was in the $2 million range or right near there. I think it's also gone up. So it may have they may be doing better for lower end staffers, but they're still not making comfortable incomes for living in Washington, D.C. It's really a challenge for like a staff assistant. But if you're a comms director, it's a little bit better. If you're a legislative assistant, it's a little better. You get into legislative director and the chief of staff range, and you've got the guy who runs the district director. Those tend to make a little bit better pay. So it can vary, but pay it can be an issue. But it's at the end of the day, if you have high turnover, it's the member ultimately, or a chief of staff that they wrongly chose. Yeah.
You're going to get what you pay for. So if you're paying someone $35,000, $40,000 a year to live in Washington, D.C., high quality people are not going to live in Washington, D.C. trying to make that and scratch that out. I mean, just for folks who are listening saying, wow, I could live on $35,000, $40,000. Yeah, you probably can in Springfield, Missouri, or in Huron, South Dakota, or wherever it might be where your cost of living is cheaper. Try that in D.C. I'll give you an example. We were doing interviews all day yesterday. It was getting late in the afternoon, probably around 4:30, 4 o'clock. We had not had anything to eat. So we went a couple blocks off Capitol Hill, 2 blocks, a block and a half off Capitol Hill. Found a pizza place, and for 3 of us to have 2 slices of pizza and some Sprite, the bill, $87.
Oh yeah,
$87. And we looked at that and we said, well, no wonder these people have struggled with if they're staffers. I think some members of Congress, a lot of them will come here and get an apartment or townhome off Capitol Hill with another member of Congress because of the high cost, right?
Yeah, when I was there the first time, actually, and Tim Huelskamp was one of them. There was about a dozen members of Congress that slept in their offices. They didn't even rent.
I remember that.
Yeah, and that still happens. There are some out there that do that. Yeah, it's $174,000 a year that a member of Congress makes, and honestly, seriously, it's not a bad income even with the costs they have, but they're pretty substantial costs that they have to deal with. I mean, I flew back and forth home my first round in D.C. Every weekend because I wasn't moving my family up to D.C. and I did not get the courtesy of having my flights paid for because I didn't live in the district, and even if I had, it probably would have blown the budget out just a little bit too much for me to do that. And I paid for my own living space there and I did do that because I didn't have the luxury of sleeping in the office. So I took a big sacrifice, and I was doing it on chief of staff pay. But that's not too bad. I mean, anyway, so it's not like members of Congress are hurting. It's just the fact that, yes, it is very expensive. Now, I've found through the years that groceries in the D.C. metro area are roughly the same as anywhere else in the country. But to go out to eat, forget it. It's way too expensive. And by the way, you cannot live on $30,000 a year. Yeah, and you can't live on $30,000 a year on that income in an area where the median home price is above $800,000. Like, that's just impossible.
That's exactly right. Yeah, my wife was asking me, what do you think that house costs as we were on the Beltway? I said, that's got to be at least $800,000 house right there. You're exactly right. And so the point we're making here, folks, is the congressmen or the senators are successful not only because of who they are, what they stand for, and their values and their worldview, but they got to have quality staffers. And some of them, maybe have that, and some of them maybe don't. But you get what you pay for. And we've run into it this week with some of them that weren't doing their jobs. And now one of them, at least, their boss just found out he was not happy. All right, on to other topics. Let's talk about the Epstein files. Okay, so I think the Epstein files ought to come out. But what about the files related to some fund? I don't really know a lot about it. You'll tell me, I'm sure. Some fund up here on Capitol Hill where if a member of Congress has sexually harassed somebody and there's an investigation and your taxpayers pay out, the taxpayers pay out of this fund up here $1 million, $2 million to make that charge or whatever go away. What do you make of that?
So when I was working for Thomas Massey back in 2017, this was already something we knew about. So when I worked, well, let me back up a little further. When
I guess
went
you
to work
got
for
like 15 seconds to answer. I guess you got, because I know the music is playing. So you got like 15 seconds.
So I'll cut it down to this. $17 million was reported in 2017 being paid for sexual harassment suits. And this protects a lot of members of Congress. It's been doing so out of the Speaker's office fund for years. It's crazy. It does need to be revealed as much as the Epstein files.
Okay, reveal the Epstein files and who has harassed people and made you, the taxpayer, pay for it. That is the Worldview Tube Washington Report. We did it all off the cuff, including an exclusive interview with Congressman Chip Roy because I dropped Jim's name. Take care, America.
You're watching Worldview Tube.